American parents without supports suffer more pressure and frustration in trying to take care of children than any of the other developed nations. For example, in France, casual babysitting for children under 3 is $1 an hour subsidized childcare in a quality center with a master's degree teacher and a community college degree or associate's degree, assistant teacher and a registered nurse, and a sick room where sick children can go. The United States doesn't have any of that. It doesn't have, and it has the greatest child poverty in the developed world. The poorest population in the United States are children under 5, but more about that later. So it's kind of no wonder that we lead the other 24 wealthier nations of the world with the most child abuse and the most child murder. Children have no independent money. They're needful. People with no money who are needful in the United States are at an extreme disadvantage. Look at daycare. A quality daycare in the San Francisco area for 2 kids is about $45,000 a year because the second kid has a slight discount. The average reasonable, not quality, but decent childcare costs more than a community college tuition every year. So that people whose parents don't have money have their kids warehoused in some apartment sitting in wet diapers looking at television sets in the years 0 to 2, the most important years for basic brain formation. But it's not just the money, although that's important. It's also social connection. If you have social connection, if you have family who'll help you out, if you have friends who'll pitch in, if you have a sense of being part of an organization of people who understand where you're at, it will help you have some kind of basic security, some kind of sense that people are saying yes to your very existence. And as I said before about ontological security, without the basic security of saying, yes, you are important, you are part of our world, life is so much harder. And with trauma, life is even harder than that. Trauma for children includes things like being left alone. Parents who don't have childcare tend, if they want to go out for the evening, to leave the kid alone. So the child wakes up utterly alone and unprotected. Or in the car while someone has a job interview, some poor woman was arrested for leaving her child in the parking lot because she needed desperately to go to this interview and she couldn't afford childcare. It also means observing violence between people in your house or violence against you. It's interesting, with every spike of another percentage of unemployment, which means the pressures on a family, there's a corresponding spike to shaken baby syndrome, where people are so driven mad by a baby's crying that they shake it violently until its brain turns to jelly, and it can either be blind or dead or retarded. And they're not by evil people, but they're by people driven to desperation. What happens to a traumatized person, particularly a child, is that the brain releases a powerful cocktail of uppers, lowers, and painkillers that allow the child to get offline and not understand that he or she has no protection in the world, that there's nobody there. It's exactly corresponding to the coma that one goes into after a physically violent assault. The body closes down in order to preserve the body's system. It goes down. Well, psychologically, the brain and body release uppers, lowers, and painkillers to drive the kid offline because a child can't face that the people there to protect her or him won't be there, that there is no one there, and that they may even be predators. That's too much. And what's very interesting is that cocktail is later enhanced by the drugs one takes, which increase the level of being offline. And if the drug that you take, if the way you got over knowing that you were so utterly alone and disconnected was by being hyper, then you'd take cocaine. If it were being absent, you'd take heroin. That's why those things are related. That's why with inequality, poverty and addiction spike for everybody. That's why the United States is now in an opioid epidemic. Americans are 5% of the world's population. We take 80% of the world's heroin. Very impressive. The leading cause of accidental death in the United States of 47,000 people is overdose. It outstrips car accidents and everything else. Part of that is heroin and opioids get people offline. They enhance the already offline feeling that one has when one is utterly disconnected or preyed upon and can't be conscious to realize it. It's a result of America's capitalistic-driven epidemic of dissociation, of disconnection, and of trauma for a whole people, especially parents and children. So, if I'm trying to put it all together, which I'm trying to put it all together for you, ontological security is essential for any kind of mental health. That's one of the reasons that, according to the book, The Spirit Level, that studies this, they show that the more unequal the society, the higher the rate of addiction, obesity, and every kind of mental illness. And then there's an update by Schrecker and Bambry, How Politics Makes Us Sick, which talks about the correspondence between neoliberal policies and inequality and every form of social ill, including addiction. So what one needs is a yes from parents or caregivers. Doesn't have to be parents, but caregivers. A yes from school. A yes from the wider society. A yes at a job. Yes, you are important. Yes, you are part of the world. And America says no, particularly to the poor. It is the developed country the least supportive of families and children. It's a nation of trauma, poverty, and inequality with all of its ramifications. And by the way, well, I'll save that till later. Trauma and what it does biochemically is then enhanced by addiction. America is a country of huge loneliness and inequality. The symptoms of mass murder, and which is basic disconnection. You have to really be disconnected to go into a public place and randomly shoot strangers. It's an epidemic that has to do with disconnection, loneliness, insecurity, ontological insecurity, and abandonment in family and society. So capitalism delivers mental illness from children on. 1 in 9 kids in America is on some form of psych med. Now, partly that's because the psychopharmaceutical industry hustles these meds for profit, but also because people bring their children in because they're terribly upset. Surprise, surprise. It robs the security of being okay, Organizations like this one are the way to stop it. People here know they're needed. They're needed to do something important together and to care for each other. People coming together for personal health and for political change. Now, as we look around, one of the things that hasn't been talked about except by me, and not even very much by me, is that the most popular organization in the United States, one that is present in every tiny town across this entire nation, is AA, organized through communist principles. No money is allowed. People are there to share their pain. They're there to bring each other around out of the strength of their shared need for each other. Now, unfortunately, they have 12 steps. The 13th doesn't ask, what are the social conditions that have enhanced my addiction, my alcoholism, or any of the other things you're in a 12-step for? Which is, of course, a crucial question that would probably give them less free space than they have across this nation. And it is organizations like this that will provide the difference. Social connection, personal connection, and ontological security. Now, I also want to point out that one of the things that seems to be slowly awakening people out of the comatose political, social, and personal state they've been in is a sense of hope and connection outside, which is starting to happen. As Rick pointed out in an article on race, African Americans were the shock absorbers for America. First fired, last hired, poorest, and they always could attribute that to there's something in the melanin that makes this happen. Melanin meaning pigmentation. But now that the mass of Americans is also experiencing the same throwaway from society, we are waking up, realizing we need each other, and we have to organize into organizations to sustain the changes that we need. So that this organization, and it's one of the reasons I'm really glad to come here every year for no money. Because this organization...
We do buy you dinners.
Yes, sometimes. This organization does exactly what we need. Has people come together because of a shared dream and a shared realization that we need one another for basic ontological security as well as any hope for a world in which we're all welcome. The end, for now.
So we're now going to take hands for questions.
Or comments.
And comments, yeah.
I gotta tell you before we begin, this is my nightmare. I took my daughter when she was 4 to a museum where they had an astronomy exhibit on the ceiling, and because she was cute and stuff, at the end they said, any questions, and she raised her hand and waved it, and they called on her, and she said, yes. What was that about? Very good question. So I'm hoping that is not the question.
So if you can try to keep your comments and questions to about 2 minutes or less. We just want to give as many people a chance to speak as possible. And if someone raises their hand and they haven't spoken yet, I'll try to call on them first. So. The floor is yours.
I have a question like your 4-year-old daughter. How do you spell ontology?
Ontologically relates to being of a whole group. ONTOLOGICAL, and then security. It was a concept originally formulated by R.D. Laing in the 70s or 60s, and it's been picked up in this year by Martin R. Smith, who works on addiction and why it happens.
Thank you.
Could you say a few more words about the spirit level and then follow up on the politics?
Yeah. Sure. Well, what the spirit level does, it's by Wilkinson and Pickett, not to be confused with Wilson Pickett. although they have similar names. And what it does is it shows that as inequality rises, every ill rises too. Homicide, incarceration, child abuse, obesity and other eating disorders, addictions, and there are 5 more, but every social ill rises too. And although they don't explain it, I could see it on both sides with my clients, that the more you're unequal, the less you relate to the whole group. Wealthy people used to mix in the United States with people who were less wealthy because they all went to the same public school. Things have gotten so much more separate now that they don't associate with each other. Wealthy kids go to private school. For example, Sidwell Friends School, where the Obama's children go, and where Biden's children go, and where other privileged children go, has classes of about, well, it costs $45,000 a year for primary, more for high school, and that's just the tuition. On vacations, they do things like, there's a class trip to the Himalayas to study the ecology. There are trips to the Alps. They have, in their classes, they're broken up into like 10 kids to study things like advanced robotics. While if you're going to a local school in Washington, D.C., where Sidwell Friends is, you're likely to be with a population of teachers always changing because the conditions stink and the pay is less. And so you get lots of substitutes who have no real commitment. You have very few supportive services and a limited curriculum, so that you are in a whole different ballgame getting ready for school. Those kids are told, you are welcome, you are important, all these things are here for you. And the opposite is true. So that inequality breeds tremendous loneliness. And you know what's interesting? At Sidwell Friends, they also have problems. And in my practice, I remember I used to see, when I worked in New Haven, I used to see privileged kids from a fancy suburb. And one of the things that the teenagers were really proud of, we can afford drugs our teachers can't afford. Yeah. Screw them, right? We're a cut above, we don't have to listen to them. What do they get? How much money are they worth? And that there's a sense that we're separate from one another, that there is no sense of hope that we all share, and that hurts everyone. And in the spirit level, or in the, let me remember that name of that later book, 2015, it's available now. In that book, How Politics Make Us Sick, it's about neoliberal policies of inequality that breed inequality and how they create mental illness as well as other physical illnesses, by Schrecker and Bambry. It's all documented for you, that the more they have graphs showing the more unequal the people are in a nation, the more they're afflicted.
Okay, I have someone back there.
Thank you again, as always, for a very serious, enlightening topic that hits really close to home. I'm sure everybody here has felt a little bit of what you're talking about, the alienation and isolation. So, always very appreciated. I guess my question kind of follows up with what you were saying about, and I'm not trying to feel bad for the upper class, but I know that this kind of alienation and isolation also affects the youth, and also, you have a high rate of drug addiction,
Absolutely.
abuse, suicide, all these things. So in a way, it's almost like, even for those who reap the benefits of this inequality, there's still, there's no end in sight to the suffering of humanity that's been taken away.
That's right.
Basically, we're for so long we lived collectively and all these things, and now that's
More collectively, not collectively.
Right, but I'm saying that's not even an option in any direction. Even if you're a rich kid, you're still under this competition. You go to the universities and it's all competition. So there seems to be a lot of problems. So I wanted to hear more on that.
Yeah.
You touched on it.
It's going to be the poor that save the rich and do the work, just like usual. But what happens is the less you see hope and the less you feel connected to the world, the more lonely and isolated you are. And these kids are lonely and isolated. And their parents are often just busy getting themselves, the women, if they're home, that's only, there's a book called Primates of Park Avenue Primates. And it's about the upper 1% of New York City, which is more exclusive than the 1% of most places. And how they are, they're supposed to supervise all the personnel that occupy themselves with their children, but they're mainly occupied by being fashionable and wearing the right thing to pick up their kid rather than seeing their kid at the end of the day, and competing with the other parents. And that there is a sense that we're all adrift, that we aren't connected. That's how in New York, I live on 6th Avenue. I could walk, if I walk 4 blocks, I pass about 6 beggars every day. And the system means that I can't say, come on home. That would be crazy, because my house would be full. It's just like Bertolt Brecht had a play about this called The Good Woman of Sichuan. Remember? Where she invites all the beggars to her house. She gets eaten out of house and home. They're very exploitative. Then her mean uncle comes in and throws them all out. But the message is, in capitalism, you have to be the mean uncle. It distorts your humanity. And yet you need to hold on a little bit to be the good woman. And Brecht asks forgiveness to those who come after, at the hardening we all have to do just to live here, no matter who we are.
Okay, I had a hand over there.
Thank you for your talk. You made me think about this. I didn't really think about how when public school was more readily accessible, the poor and the rich were going to the same school.
Mixed.
And how that kind of allowed for more, I guess, a sense
Connection.
of connection. But I think about this concept made me think about how even probably back in the day, because classism was still, or the class system still existed.
Absolutely.
It was kind of what you're saying earlier on, is this idea of if you still have more materials, then you're better than, regardless.
That's right.
So it's like, yeah, the society is saying yes to you because you have more material goods, and so when you don't have any, it's saying no to you.
That's right.
So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit maybe about how that concept was, like how that still affects people. You still, whether you have money, the world is saying yes to you. You don't have any money. You're always comparing yourself to those that have it. So the world is still saying no to you, even if you're going to the same school, or even if you're, in the same club, or you go, I don't know. I just think it's an interesting concept.
Well, it is an interesting concept. Now, it is also true that if you mix more, you get a chance. Someone will say, why don't you go to college? I know a scholarship fund. If you're a friend of their kid and they kind of take to you and you're hanging around their kitchen, there's more of a chance that you will, in a mixed group, pick up the values that are around there and the helps that could be offered. However, it also has to be understood that America has been an unequal place from the get-go. Our founding fathers, all males obviously, some might have been in drag, but I don't think so. They had long hair, who knows? In any case, what they won in our Constitution was that 6% of the population could vote. You couldn't be Native American, you couldn't be minority of any kind, you couldn't be African American, you couldn't be female, and you couldn't be without property. So in terms of democracy, invoking that standard really isn't recommended. So we did always have that. And there is a sense that it's reinforced constantly. I mean, we flew here from New York. If you're in steerage, you're sitting here like this with people's babies crying. If you're in business class, no less first class, you have a seat with little sound removers, which you can lean back and take a nap. They give you a little kit that welcomes you, gives you a present because you're so important, and so on. And you don't have to wait in the same kind of line. And if you want a pillow or a blanket, you don't have to pay extra. These are the experiences that surround us all the time. And because we have TV, everybody can see the rich and famous and what they don't have and how deprived they are. And they don't get the message, this is an evil way of organizing things, folks. No. And so that's everywhere. But if you have more mixing, and in New York at least, New York is much more segregated, and black incomes have gone down in this whole country since 1979. So you have, you may have a black president, and if Hillary wins, a woman president. You have elites. There's room at the top for those people willing to betray their people and have a place at the top, which there always has been. Sell your people out and get ahead, okay? But you used to have more casual mixing before things were as unequal as they were, because we can't forget that for 150 years, every generation of Americans who were white and had a male to earn in their family, and that was the majority now, which is dwindling, but it used to be really the majority, did better than the last generation. There was a sense we can make it. There's hope, there's possibility, it's out there, and that is over. And it's over for all young people, except for the very top. It's just over. And so people are beginning to feel they need each other, but it's gotten much worse in spite of all their celebrations to the contrary.
Okay, you had your hand up before.
Hi. I enjoyed your talk. And I really appreciate you focusing on class-based differences. I've been trying to think about, I've been sharing with my students the notion of a capitalist personality that is shared by almost everybody. And you mentioned a few, everybody learns to be alienated no matter where you are. And the Wilkinson book is really, I think, interesting, and you pointed out that they're saying that it's the amount of inequality hurts everybody down the line. And even a poor country, or a relatively poor country that's relatively equal, has a lot more
further ahead
happiness and all of these other qualities. But I'd just love to hear you articulate, what do we all have in common as a result of living in a capitalist society?
Well, we're all subjected to a dominator-competitor culture, which we learn very young. In New York, the buses have gun ads. They don't have ads of men vacuuming saying help out, which would be nice. They're advertising male dominance. And the movies that they push are often exactly doing that. And, you can see it even, there's a cute book by Laurie Siegel for little kids. It's out of print, but I can see why. It's terrific. And one of the stories is about Susie and Jonah going to the park in the sandbox. And Jonah has a new truck, Susie has a pail and 2 shovels, and they're having a great time shoveling the sand into the pail, putting it in the truck and dumping it. And the parents say, isn't that nice? It's good to share, and you're sharing. Then Jonah says to Susie, you can have my dump truck. And the mother says, that costs $12.50. What do you mean he could have it? And she says, well, you could have my pail and shovel. And the mother says, that's $5. Give him back that truck. And, okay, from the very beginning, the money is very important. And kids learn, okay, sharing, forget about sharing. you know? It's more like you grab somebody's toys and run and scream share over your shoulder. Okay. You know, you do learn right away that on the one hand they're saying something, on the other hand they're taking it back. And so you get to feel you're in this dominator, competitor culture, and that if you can't compete because you don't have the money, you're at a serious disadvantage. And one of the things that a good left organization like this one does is say, we can compete because we have solidarity. We have each other and we're the majority. That's a different message. And that's what has to get out there.
Okay, I had you next on the, oh, yeah.
Which was the you, there were two
You,
together.
in the speaker.
Yeah. So once again, thank you very much for an awesome talk. I was hoping you could sort of go into the flip side of sort of a way forward, because I know that in the past you've talked about the relationship of social movements and how that can relate to people coming together and feeling important and really contributing together, you know, expanding how they can, you know, really participate and contribute. Like you've given the example of the solidarity movement in Poland, and so just other insights like how can coming together really concretely change how we view ourselves as human beings, how we interact with others.
Well, one great example now is the Black Lives Matter movement. Because it's out there, we are now noticing that the police constantly kill black people. They've always been doing that, but it slid by. Now, people are aware of it. And now people like Colin Kaepernick, is that how you say it? Can refuse, and then others can follow his example. Real high prestige people, like athletes in this society, who are paid a lot. He gave $1 million to Black Lives Matter. And he said, that's because I can afford it. All you can afford to do is get out there, but do it. And he's followed by people all over the place. What happens is, at some point, people realize I can do something about this. And they often realize, because there's a movement, making people realize they're not alone, the way Colin did by just kneeling. The whole high school football team in Houston, I think, Texas, did that. They all kneeled together. And there is a sense that by joining in a group and doing something public, you begin to change the consciousness, and then the powers that be think they have to make an adjustment. Now, of course, they'll unadjust it the first chance they get. But you can also see it because of Bernie Sanders. You have Hillary pretending she's for average people. She came up with a child care plan, and so did Trump. Because Bernie had a universal, and they came up with, at least Hillary came up with a help for public education on the college level, community colleges. Because of that movement. Because Bernie Sanders wasn't just a candidate, it was a movement. 175,000 volunteers the first week. You saw his rallies, 40,000 people. Hers, about 100, 1,075, 2,000, mostly paid. It was a different thing. It was a movement. It was an excitement. And so what happens is when people move together and make a public presence, all those frightened, traumatized people who felt there was something wrong but couldn't articulate it, find a voice and a place to be. And the more the mass of people finds a place to be that affirms the power of a mass of people to make change, then the more change happens. It's the way it happens. The New Deal was not created because FDR was a nice guy. He got in on the balanced budget. But he couldn't compete with what was happening. Hundreds of thousands of people organized by the Communist Party, marching through the streets demanding employment. Or as I told somebody before, because it's a recent revelation to me, that in the rural areas, in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, places that are not the seats of radicalism you might imagine, you don't imagine it, the judges who foreclosed family farms were killed. They were lynched by the community. There were pitched battles. They had to call in the National Guard till FDR had the Agricultural Recovery Act that the government took over that. They wouldn't have taken it over if people hadn't organized to go to the auctions and prevent anybody from bidding more than $1 on anything. So they had to ban the auction. Or in the Communist Party in New York, where there were evictions, people would come immediately and take the stuff off the truck and put it back in the apartment. Because there was a movement, because 1 out of 4 Americans had a relative in the Communist Party then. It was a mass movement. And it had a presence. So people knew there was a place to go, something to do. They could come out. They were less traumatized and disconnected and alone. That's how it works. Does that answer it or no? A little? Okay.
Actually, behind you. Yeah, you're next.
For me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, probably we should start a movement of creating the radical group therapy.
That's true.
Luxembourg therapy nuts.
That's cute. It's true. That's what all the 12 steps are, radical group therapy.
Okay, no, I'm not go serious. I've always been intrigued by, I'm sorry to call it this way, but like an American exceptionalism in the sense of how capitalism works in this country. I mean, you were mentioning of the, comparing the USA in terms of massacres with other imperialist or advanced industrial countries. But the truth is, I mean, you don't hear, like in many third world countries, unless it's political organized violence, like some guy in Costa Rica went and blew up 40 people in a shopping center, or in Belize, or Bolivia. Like, so it's like particularly very much an American, phenomena that is so widespread, like these actions. But I'm also, curious. I've been, a leftist in this country for a while, and I, became a communist somewhere else. But, like in many countries, people start doing politics locally. Like the communists do, like in my neighborhood, I used to be involved in little things, like if a road needed to be repaired, etc. We communists let us know to the neighborhood that we were on their side doing local things, and then we could go to the bigger things. In this country, it's like, you don't know your neighbors. You know, like who lives right.
That's right, you're alienated.
And, I always try to tell my leftist friends, why it is that in the USA people do politics starting from the top. Like, we do a lot of solidarity work and the big issues. But, in the neighborhoods, it's like people I don't know. How could you go to the top if you don't start even, from the bottom doing things?
Well, there's lots of ways to do everything, and I think people are alienated. In the 70s and the 60s, in the 60s, I was involved in the civil rights movement and starting a civil rights movement in New Haven, Connecticut. The conditions in the school where I taught were so terrible that me and 5 other people got the names from the secretary and visited every parent. It was an overwhelmingly African American and Hispanic school, and said, your kids aren't getting educated. You've got to do something about it. And they did. And that was a local thing. Of course, what they accomplished was they got a black principal who was terrible too, but he was brown. But, you need actions everywhere. And I think you do need local actions. We used to go door to door. It was a different America, though.
Yeah.
And so people didn't think you were going to kill them when you rang their bell. And part of what they've done is so frightened people of one another that if somebody wants to knock on your door and come in and talk to you, they better be looking well-dressed and unthreatening, because people are basically afraid of one another, which means that you have to start organizing through a local church or through a local organization of some kind, so people can get, rather than just going to your neighbors who you're afraid of. In the 1940s and the 1950s, and even into the beginning of the 1960s, before the drugs were delivered, probably by the CIA, it looks like, into the poor neighborhoods, tenement doors, poor people's doors were open. One of Rick's and my best friends was a kid he questioned the rabbi. He got a scholarship because he was so smart. He questioned the rabbi in this Jewish school his parents sent him to, because he was the only kid who got a scholarship because he was so smart. He questioned his teacher, who sent him to the lead rabbi. And he had his questions. He told the rabbi hit him, so he punched that rabbi right back in the nose. And he got home, and his father said, "You're a shame on the family." He was in 7th grade then, so he picked up his pillow and some of his toys. He went to live with this nice Puerto Rican family down the hall, because their door was always open. His first language was Yiddish, his second was Spanish, because he hung out with these nice Spanish people down the hall. And he basically, that was his family. But you don't, and even I, in my childhood in Manhattan, my mom was not very interested in us, so my sister and I went and visited all these people in the family. Some of it wasn't so great. This guy liked to have us watch him wipe himself and stuff, which wasn't recommended. But whatever it was, we stopped, we talked to people, we went all over the place. But that fluidity of people trusting one another enough to keep their door open and welcoming a little kid who wandered in, that's over. With the drug epidemic comes the terror of being robbed. So you have to meet through organizations at a place where people go to trust one another.
So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about just the impact of work. So I remember Jack London. Jack London wrote this book called The People of the Abyss. Mm-hmm. He goes to East London in 1902, and he just starts describing the conditions, and he talks about alcoholism and how you had alcohol way before capitalism, but the rates of alcoholism don't really kick in until you shove people into these
terrible places. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is that, that's interesting to me, is it a lot of times alcoholism is explained sort of just as escapism, but it sounds like what you're saying is it's the addiction
trauma
component is sort of this relieving of the stress. So how much of just the trauma can be at an early age, but trauma by going to work for the vast majority of your life, your time is taken from you, the time you could spend with your family, with your friends, doing something, generating wealth for somebody else. I mean, work itself is sort of a permanent trauma under capitalism.
It is, and the more and the worse the conditions, and they're getting worse and worse as capitalists get away with it, are traumatic. And the way, unfortunately, unless there's a present movement, people adjust to trauma is through releasing biochemicals, because every emotional state has a biochemical component, is by releasing painkillers and uppers and downers so they don't have to know what's going on. And that's why letting people know what's going on can help them come out. Because alcoholism and other addictions happen because you're so offline already, you need that added enhancement to go further. Because you're already there. And the solidarity that you get by coming together is a solidarity of like-minded sufferers. One of the ways AA got started was that Bill W., because you're not supposed to be an ego in this group, and you're not supposed to say your last name and get personal credit, he went and he was told that he would not live if he continued to drink. So he went to a pastor and he said, who in your congregation, who else is an intelligent drunk? I need another drunk. And he got him connected to a guy named Johnson. And they started AA because they realized they needed fellow sufferers. That's the therapy element that you mentioned. And that you then can achieve emotional sobriety as well as intellectual sobriety and look around and understand what's happening. You can get back online. Alcohol helps you get offline. It changes and it enhances the already dissociated, gone behavior that you've had to cultivate to endure your life.
Yeah, thank you. I was reminded in your talk, and thank you for the talk, how much the sociopathic character that comes about because of this alienation, disassociation, is came into our culture big time with Ayn Rand and her James Edward Hickman model, the sociopathic killer that
That's right.
in 1927. And then today you have Supreme Court justices, heads of corporations, people in Congress, this character Ryan, passing out her books to people that it's a must read. And the whole thing is based on somebody who had no morality nor no conscience. And she was ecstatic that this sort of person existed.
Yeah, well, that is the ideal of the dominator-competitor culture. That's, to some extent, although Trump does at least misbehave in a way that is endearing to a lot of people who would like to kick the elites, he is a sociopath,
Yeah.
and so is she. I mean, one of the things that is not known about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, although you could look it up on Google and find it, is they both took between 10 and 26 flights on the Lolita Express, where wealthy men get to rape underage girls. The guy who ran it, Jeffrey Epstein from London, is somebody for whom Trump put in a good word, and he's in jail. He was in jail for these pedophile operations. And Hillary Clinton can look the other way while her husband rapes people, and Trump can be raping people.
Did Bill Clinton went on?
Yes, between 10 and 26 flights. Look it up under Lolita Express. Google Lolita Express, Bill Clinton. Now, naturally, they're not accusing one another because the other one's in the same boat, and they were good friends. What kind of a sociopathic maniac is that?
Yeah.
And he is a better spoken sociopathic maniac.
Yeah.
But also the elites have this indifference to the mass of people in their elegant way. They bomb the world and eat organic mushrooms. Okay. You know?
After the bombing in Gaza 2 years ago, Hillary Clinton was asked about it. I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah, I'm gonna just so everyone gets
Yeah.
a chance to talk. Okay, yeah, you're next.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'm just wondering if you could discuss a little bit about the possible role of religion here. One of the things that when you were talking about why is the United States unique in their form of capitalism, I've read is that one of the can be attributed to the founding culture, the Puritanism, Calvinism. And you get the ideas that if you're rich, it's because you're doing something right, or if you're poor, it's because you sinned or you're doing something wrong. And just like some of my evangelist, born-again friends, they're very big on the idea of, well, they're against welfare altogether, but if you have to have welfare, you better get drug tested, and
Be worthy.
about this.
Right. Well, I think religion had a role, although they like to invoke these founding fathers. 9 of them were non-believers, so, they weren't all religious. But there is something about Protestantism and Calvinism that did say that God shows his rewards. Creflo Dollar, the evangelist from the South, did the same. But religion is waning now because, as the comedian, said, Jesus doesn't bring the pork chops. People aren't being rewarded for believing. And yet, religion can be a lifeline to a community. It's a sense of community, and it depends on where you go with it. Martin Luther King was part of a vital African American church movement in the South. And like everything else, it can go both ways. Now, generally, it's on the side of the rich. That's always true. But there are always also exceptions that bring people together in a community and celebrate the people that make up that community. So it could be a mixed bag. But the role of religion in the United States has been on the side of the ruling class, the way it always is in every society. One of the things Putin is trying to do is reintroduce the Russian Orthodox Church. And it is, the big institutions of society tend to thrive because they go with the establishment and rationalize it. And yet there are always the exceptions.
Okay, it's your turn. Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
Oh, Victor.
Thank you for coming, Harriet. My concern and question is how to distinguish sometimes between these ideological issues rather than, for example, psychological. Mostly, for example, for somebody like Ted Cruz or Donald Trump, they say, oh, he's crazy. Of course, they are not talking about being clinically crazy, but it seems to me
qualified.
Could be, but I think as for them to be leaders or getting votes and totally it's a social issue, it seems to me something to do with ideology. Can you please shed some light on that?
Okay, well, one of the things that's very important ideologically is that these people's ideology fits their personal need to get ahead in a dominator-competitor culture. And I remember in women's liberation, when it just started, finding a principle that was really useful for our organization because other organizations were coming in and telling us what to do. And the policy that was accepted is everybody is welcome unless they know exactly what we are supposed to do. Then they can't come. That's it. Because often ideology is just an excuse for your own agenda. You have to come with a basic thing. We need each other, and we need change so that all of us can come along. And that can cut through whatever crap you're laying on top of it. Not that it isn't useful to study ideas, it's good to read Marx, it's good to read a lot of stuff, but the basic idea is we need each other. And without that solidarity, we can't change our lives. And that doesn't have to do with one group being more oppressed. We're all in it together. And we have to be in it together because we're all we have. And I think that cuts below the ideology, which is generally used to excuse whatever it is you're benefiting from.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful and kind of struck a personal note too, because personally going through addiction is really challenging, and it's
terrible.
It's a byproduct of the competitive capitalist culture you were mentioning. But I was wondering if you can maybe speak more about the pharmaceutical industry.
Oh, yeah.
The ways in which the pharmaceutical industry actually prevents more, I don't know if you want to say holistic or actual better homeopathic remedies from, being distributed to more people and all sorts, just that.
Great question. One of the ways that America is unique, terrible ways that it's unique, is we're the only nation in the developed world of the 24 more industrialized nations in the world, some of which are not very rich, like Poland or Czechoslovakia or Slovenia or something. But it's the only one that allows direct consumer advertising from pharmaceuticals. We're also one of the only ones who allows the drug studies that are submitted to be conducted by the companies themselves. Therefore, there are 30 antidepressants. This is a good example. Antidepressants, 75% of the time, work as well as sugar pills. Studies that were done in England, because they have a socialized medical system, show that. And where it does work, you have to keep taking it your whole life and keep taking more. Even the National Institutes of Mental Health, which is the government body, have decided that the biochemical theory of mental illness is wrong, and that every state has a biochemical element. However, they don't have the money to publicize it. And the pharmaceutical companies can push their theory. And so Americans have this terrible addiction to these traumatizing medications. A case in point is Zyprexa, which is a drug that was supposed to be for adult psychosis. A guy named Biederman at Harvard, who was also the head of the Harvard he was a professor at Harvard and the head of the Child Psychiatry Association, was given $3.4 million to set up an institute for himself and quite a bit of other money to say that it's safe for children, gives children diabetes, makes them obese, and doesn't help them. Oh well, in any case, when asked by another doctor at Harvard, how can you do this? Because they said, how can you do this? You got a $1.3 million fine from the United States for pushing Zyprexa on children. He said, hey, what do you mean? You're racing towards $17 billion. You pay the traffic ticket. Because that's the ideology. If it's profit uber alles, disguised as health care, that's what you get. You don't get health care, you get wealth care, as one of your t-shirts said. And that, that's the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. And the psychopharma is the most profitable within a highly profitable sector. So you're hustling everything. The studies on which you push it mean that within 5 years after every one of the 30 antidepressants was released, there were huge lawsuits against them for the damage, the sort of collateral damage, with gag clauses attached. So in the book, Learning from Prozac was financed by the drug companies. These things only come out later, and the publicity to show that is very expensive. And the companies have the money, and they're allowed to directly advertise in the United States, as they are not in any other developed nation.
I don't want the floor again, but there was part of the question not answered or unexplained.
Well, yeah, we'll keep discussing.
And you talk to me later.
Talk after, yeah. You guys are next. Yes, you guys.
Okay. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. When I think about these things, I often feel kind of stuck, because part of me wants to invest my time into community-oriented, connection activities and becoming a therapist, things like that. And then another part of me feels like that work is hopeless when capitalism is, inequality is getting worse, and without changing things at a systemic root level, that I guess more that symptom changing work doesn't feel as meaningful. So I was wondering if you could talk about the role of private practice therapy and similar techniques in the fight to dismantle capitalism.
Well, that's a really good question. One of the things you have to remember is if you're going to keep up the fight, you damn well better survive. And so the things that you need to do, which are basically helpful and might not be at the root of a revolution, which doesn't look like it's imminent right now, at another point you may figure, okay, this is the time. But you have to survive. You have to have a personal life. If you look at the wine correspondence between Marx and Engels, they seem to have caught on about that idea. You're supposed to be able to love life and to have the energy and hope then to reach out politically. But unless you're going to be sustained by a movement that allows you to give up other things, you have to have a life. And if you have a life that's doing something basically helpful, and I find as a therapist, it's a little revolution. People who couldn't have any sense that they were important and that what they needed was worth pursuing and that they mattered in the world can matter. And generally, they're more progressive afterwards, but it's not an organizing tool. It's a tool of personal liberation. And you have to find a way to exist within the capitalist system. We live in the belly of the whale. That's where we live. And so we have to survive and try to enjoy ourselves, too. It's very important.
Did you want to ask something or say something? You? No. 2 rows in front of you. You in the maroon sweater?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh.
I did your hand up
It
earlier.
was a long time ago, but
A lot of people want to talk.
Yeah, that's okay.
just a couple of thoughts about some of the things that you said when you were talking about walking down 6th Avenue and how wrenching that can be and what you need to do to kind of deal with that on a daily basis. And I would suggest that San Francisco, the incidence of encounters would be even greater, interestingly enough. Made me think back to your introducing the good person of Sichuan, because the relative she brings in is herself.
Of course, they're the two sides under capitalism.
Herself
Yeah.
as this bad guy relative, because she, undisguised, didn't have the armor
Right.
to deal with that pain.
It's a good point.
Yeah, so that was one thought I had. The other, I guess, had to do, it's been a long time since I read R.D. Laing, decades. So I was really grateful for the concept of ontologic security. And that had to do with, I think, your question about how social movements can help create that.
Yes,
Ontological
they
security.
can.
I mean, it was that I just kind of put those things together because we are meaning-making creatures.
Mhm.
We want our lives to make sense and to feel like we're making a difference, and that's kind of the healing.
That's right.
of the social movement.
And it's also part of what religion can potentially give, that God is actually looking at you. You may not feel like it, but God is actually caring that you live, even though nobody else seems to.
Thank you. I thought this was really wonderfully interesting. I really thought that the 1 in 9 number that 1 out of 9 children today are being medicated just
Sick.
out of the water. It's really sick. I actually teach in one of those schools similar to Sidwell Friends, so I'm around young people all the time, and who come from either very, very privileged backgrounds or a minority of kids who have very, very little and landed there somewhere. And so income inequality exists in my school in a way that's just really extraordinary. And the anxiety that's produced, the tension that's produced by this community that mirrors the society as a whole, except that it's very top-heavy, the wealth, and produces an extraordinary amount of stress and despair on the kids. And so what I wanted to say actually was something very hopeful, is that what I'm seeing today, because of what happened in Ferguson and everything that followed, because of Black Lives Matter, because of Occupy, before that, what I see is that now at my school, Black Student Union is bigger than ever. The Women's Affinity Group is huge, fighting for consent, which understandably is a very low bar for what the relationships between men and women
It's
should
better
be.
than not consent.
It's better than not consent by a long shot. And that a lot of these kids feel that there's got to be something else. And socialism is viewed very, very positively in this community. And it brings me back to what you said about reform will save the rich. And I can see it in my world here in Oklahoma.
The majority of people under 30 think socialism is better than capitalism, even if they may not know what they are, either of them. They know that what they have is not good.
Okay, yeah, that's you.
Yeah, thanks as always for coming here. It's always a pleasure.
For me
And
too.
This time I was sort of your 12-step program. I'm glad this time we got to the 13th step. But it just seems like there really is this continuum where one is you're really having to deal with such a, that early trauma. So it's all these stages of basic paralysis that we see and the difficulty of getting to that 13th step where people feel freed enough to actually start to take the steps, be courageous enough, feel empowered enough to begin to move. And sort of to add to your pitch for our group, one of the things that we see in various workplaces where we have newsletters where people actually get to articulate, talk about those basic problems that he referred to in the workplace that are just add to that trauma, to try to build some basic sense of solidarity before people are really ready to move. And maybe then they write an article and they say, my gosh, here's an article that I wrote, and they're showing other people. And then that becomes sort of the norm. We have so many people who understand but are at some stage of paralysis. And I think then there's also, especially having not grown up in the Bay Area, this constant sort of self-help. I am going to finally get there. And it's impossible to do that
By
ourselves. And I know you're a wonderful therapist, but I don't think you could free us. You can't be free either, right?
Right.
So I think that's one of the, I really am glad we have your 13th step now.
Yeah, it's needed.
I also want to thank you, as always, for coming and for your humor, as well as your enlightenment. And I wanted to talk about some examples, sort of going back to what he asked about the more positive, because obviously listening to the statistics, there's always that moment where I feel like lying on the floor with my arms and legs in the air, because it's so discouraging, especially when we're talking about children who didn't ask to be born or treated that way. So I was thinking of a couple of examples of my own experience in the civil rights movement in terms of alienation and transformation through sort of collective activity. And I was doing a voter registration leafleting, and I ran into a woman who was on welfare. She had 7 kids. She had just moved her 7 kids in a little red wagon to get away from her alcoholic husband. And we were there all day handing out flyers, so she was telling me her life story. And at the end of the day, I said, we have to do something. And she burst out laughing. She said, well, what did you have in mind? So I said, we could write a leaflet. That I knew how to do. And she said, and yeah, after we write it, what are we going to do with it? And I said, why don't we go to the welfare department? I'm sure there are other people who have the same problem. So she wrote basically everything she hated about the welfare department. We ran a leaflet. We handed out 1,000 leaflets at the welfare department. And we had a meeting that night of 50 people and organized a group. And all of those 50 people found in each other the alienation, the terrible feelings of no self-esteem, all the problems that they had. But mostly, I think, and I remember the body language. I was 19, so I was also a sociological observer of everything that I was doing at the same time as I was doing it. People physically looked different by the end of the meeting. They came in sort of discouraged and depressed, and they didn't want to talk very loud, and they'd never been in a meeting. By the time they were done, they had elected officers, written a 10-point program, and an organizing plan for the week. So that's one story. Down the street from the office where we lived in East Baltimore, there was a pool hall. And they were very suspicious of us, the people in the pool hall, like, what the heck were we really doing? And that's what they asked. Okay, you say you're doing welfare rights organizing, you say you're doing tenants organizing, you say that you're running a nonprofit fuel store, but behind it, what are you really doing? Because what were they really doing behind the pool hall? They were running numbers and selling drugs and
Right.
stolen goods, whatever.
Maybe you were
We might be
competing,
doing-
right.
We might have competition, or we might have a better idea for how to do it. When they learned finally that there really was nothing else going on, they refused to picket because they thought that that was ridiculous. They were not gonna walk in front of a landlord's house carrying that picket sign. That was for us to do, but they were our defense guard. And they would
That's
show up
great.
at every picket line and stand on the corners to make sure the police would never do anything. Because they figured we probably couldn't handle ourselves, but they knew that they could. And besides, they knew all the police because they paid them off. So it's a very interesting thing. And the final example, and you touched on it a little bit, and I think it was so interesting to me to live through the riots of the 60s. And what you saw during the riots of the 60s is when people were angry and they turned their anger collectively against the system, people-on-people crime completely disappeared.
Right.
People stopped drinking, they stopped taking drugs,
They had a
and instead
chance.
they fought. And
Yeah.
I think that's where the hope really lies.
Although it has to be
That
a little
when
more
people are
channeled.
together,
Yeah.
they find themselves, but they find themselves through the collectivity.
That's right.
Yeah, thanks again. So, yeah, I was just, kind of one thought that I had was where, where we're looking at a world basically of humanity that's broken and beaten into the ground, where people do find the potential, and when they do come together, they see that there's actually a possibility to do something else. But also, if we do not have already a network, already an organization with a clear perspective of what needs to be done to actually get rid of this once and for all, to really transform this world for everybody to have a home and actually have a place to thrive, right? We're gonna keep having the same battles over and over again.
That's right.
It's gonna just throw us back again and again. Right, so I was wondering, and I'm not too sure if you're familiar with a book called From the Dead Level, but it's a book that it's written by Tim Duong, and it made a big impact on me because it was really somebody who comes from a really difficult background and who sees basically a reason to pick himself up, and it was really the Nation of Islam that inspired him and that showed him that, well, shit, this is exactly what they want us to do.
Like Malcolm X had the same kind of.
So, this guy was a little bit different, yeah, but I was wondering if you could comment on kind of the challenge maybe that we face in organizing people who really do come from a difficult background and who bring in habits and kind of challenges in order to build the type of organization that we need. Because if we're really going to fight and make this fight on a global scale, we're going to have to, change some things about ourselves as well.
Yeah, well, one of the examples of success in that, in its very brief life, was Occupy, where everybody was together and where somebody started acting out. They surrounded them physically. They had a group of people and then just moved them over to the side and said, this is why this can't happen if you want to stay here. And I think if the basic principle is we need each other, everyone has to be respected here. You too, but everybody. And keep enforcing that and understand. I think people really do want to understand. They want to understand what the hell is going on. Why are they so unhappy? Why do they feel so little hope? What can they do? And when people act out, they ought to be told that can't happen. And if it keeps happening, they can't be welcome. Because people need one another. And also, in every group, there are unfortunate conflict addicts. People in California used to have a conflict addict anonymous. Of course, they eventually dissolved because of the conflict. But because there are people who like to create enmity in the group and conflict in the group. And then people in the group get alienated because they didn't come there to be in the middle of a conflict. They came there because they wanted to affirm their connectivity instead of conflict. And people have to be there. You do need a leader to say, this doesn't fly. We're here to affirm our connection with each other. This is disruptive to the group, and the group is more important than your individual beef right now. And if you don't like it, you can't be here. I think we have to be pretty strict. In order to have a group that functions, you have to have standards of how people are treated. You don't have to have ideological standards, but the way people are treated, and the basic principle that we need each other, which are very basic.
Okay. So I have one more person in the back here. Yeah.
I'm supposed to extend greetings from Catherine Friend's husband, Bob. We were walking. My wife and I came in late because of BART service, so I missed your speech. But I do have the book, the work you've done so much on about the family. So if my question is not germane, I can do it at another time. But could you unpack a little bit about, from your article, Toiling in the Field of Emotion, regarding damaged adults, emotional labor in the authoritarian family. Do you have time to unpack that? If it's not germane to your presentation, which we missed, unfortunately, I'd be glad to.
No, I think that's okay. That's okay. I mean, one of the things that happens is in an authoritarian family, you're asked to suppress your own need, your own idea, your own wish to obey the authority. And what happens is that you go either of two ways. You either crush yourself and hate anybody who makes trouble and turn on them, which is what happens with fascists. The leader is invincible, and you put all the hatred that you accumulated through being oppressed and hate the one who is making trouble. In every population, starting with the studies of the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1930s, looking at fascism, and then later in the end of the 1990, Robert Altemeyer in Canada found that about 20% of the population who are from authoritarian families have a sadistic need to punish anyone who speaks out and is different. You could see that when people criticized George Bush, when the Dixie Chicks lead singer said that she's ashamed that she was born in Lubbock, Texas, just like George Bush, and she got death threats, and people smashed her records, and she was thrown off the country stations. Then you have about 60% of the people who would go either way. And Germany, before World War II, used to have a very authoritarian family structure. It changed because part of what people realized was that the authoritarian family structure fostered fascism. Then there's about 20% of the population who see themselves connected in a wider way and connected to everyone, and they won't become fascists. They will oppose anything that crushes other people. And the authoritarian family is the inculcation into authoritarian structure that then transfers to the authoritarian classroom and the authoritarian church and the authoritarian government, where you're nobody, you're nothing. And you hate with all the venom of your own repressed longing, you hate the person who raises their head. And the mass of people could go either way. And in Toiling in the Field of Emotion, in that article, I talked about emotional labor. That part of what I consider now the dominator-competitor culture is that the emotional labor we all have to do to connect with one another, to see the other person, to feel for the other person, has within these cultures been a dishonored an uncompensated part of the female role, helping to create cleanliness and order and kindness in a family, helping people, being early childhood educators who are sort of mommy educators, reaching out, nurturing, without which the human race wouldn't exist. But those have been, as in the Ayn Rand example, those have been qualities considered weak, as women have been considered weak. And part of what we haven't done, the women's movement didn't honor that very much either. I mean, one of our great mistakes was not to applaud what traditional women's strengths actually were in emotional labor and nurturance and kindness and order and cleanliness, and what you learn from those things, which is still not developed in our culture. What do you learn? Why are those things valuable? Instead, they were called shit work by the women's movement and dishonored. And the only place that gave honor, and only verbal honor, no real support, was the right wing. And you can see it in country music, which is right-wing populism set to music. That you love your mother and all that, and of course, if the wife leaves you, you kill her, but you know, whatever. But there's a lot of support for the traditional woman, even though they won't have childcare or any other kind of physical support that women need. But that's part of getting out of that culture, is to honor the kindness between people, to honor the basic respect, to honor the nurturance, to develop the knowledges of what you do learn and teach them to everyone as honored labor. So that's the connection.
Thank you.
Cheers.